The spirits whisper of great evil, she said in a grave tone. The land itself cries out for justice. She paused, then pointed her staff at Chinello, Ifioma, and Ngozi. The gods demand truth. The villagers murmured in agreement, their voices rising. Confess, some shouted. The gods will not be deceived. Chinello began shaking her head, her breath coming fast. No, we. Then a sudden crack split the air. Lightning flashed across the sky, though there was no storm. The fire at the center of the square flared up violently, sparks flying in every direction. The village gasped. And the three girls screamed. They fell to the ground, writhing, clutching their heads as if unseen hands were gripping their skulls. We did it. Ifioma shrieked, tears pouring from her eyes. We did it. We buried her. We thought she was dead. Chinello let out a wail. We were jealous. We couldn't let her leave us behind. Ngozi sobbed uncontrollably, pounding her fists against the dirt. We are sorry. Please, have mercy. The village erupted in chaos. People gasped, some covering their mouths, others backing away as if afraid to be near such wickedness. Amarachi stood still, watching them break, watching them crumble under the weight of their crime. But there was no satisfaction in it. Only emptiness. The chief stood, his face filled with disgust. You tried to silence your own friend out of jealousy. You buried her, thinking no one would. He turned to the elders. What punishment do these wicked ones deserve? Mama Adalai did not hesitate. They must be cast out. Banished from this land, never to return. A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. The chief nodded. Then so it shall be. At his command, the guards stepped forward. Chinello, Ifioma, and Ngozi screamed as they were dragged away, their pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. As they disappeared into the darkness, Amarachi finally let out a slow breath. It was over. Or at least, it should have been. But as the village cheered her survival, as her mother wept and held her close, Amarachi felt something deep in her chest, something cold, something unresolved. She had been given a second chance. But why? And at what cost? That night, as the village celebrated her return, Amarachi sat outside her mother's hut, staring at the moon. The echoes of the drums and singing filled the air, but she felt detached from it all. She should have felt relief. She should have been happy. But something deep inside her refused to settle. She had crawled out of the earth. She had faced her betrayers. Justice had been served. But something still felt unfinished. Her mother sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. My child, why do you look troubled? Amarachi hesitated before speaking. Mama, why did God bring me back? Her mother frowned. To expose the wicked. To show his power. Amarachi shook her head. No, it's more than that. She looked down at her hands, the dirt still embedded in her nails despite her many attempts to wash it away. I should have died, Mama. I should be in the ground right now. Her mother tightened her grip on her. Don't say that. God had other plans. But what were those plans? Amarachi sighed and leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Desmond, she whispered. Her mother's body stiffened. You need to tell him, don't you? A sharp pang went through Amarachi's chest. Desmond. The man who had promised her a new life. The man who was waiting for her, thinking she had abandoned him. How could she explain what had happened? Would he even believe her? She closed her eyes. She had to try. The next morning, with shaky fingers, Amarachi picked up her phone. It was the first time she had touched it since the night of her attack. The battery was dead. She borrowed a charger from her cousin and waited impatiently as the phone came to life. When the screen lit up, dozens of missed calls flooded in. Desmond. Over and over. His messages filled her inbox. Desmond, 3 weeks ago. Amarachi, why aren't you picking up? I'm worried. Desmond, 2 weeks ago. Are you okay? Please, talk to me. Desmond, 1 week ago. I don't understand what's going on. If you don't want this anymore, just tell me. The most recent message made her stomach drop. Desmond, 3 days ago I waited, Amarachi. I waited for you. But I can't keep waiting forever. Her heart pounded. Had she lost him? With trembling hands, she dialed his number. It rang once. Twice. Then. Hello. His voice was cautious, guarded. She swallowed hard. Desmond, it's me. There was silence on the other end. Then, a slow, disbelieving breath. Amarachi. Tears welled in her eyes. Yes. It's me. I have so much to tell you. Another long silence. Then, his voice came, low and pained. You disappeared for weeks, Amarachi. No word. No explanation. I thought you were dead. She flinched at the word. I almost was. His breathing changed. What do you mean? She closed her eyes. Desmond, they tried to kill me. A sharp intake of breath. Who? My friends. Her voice was barely above a whisper. They buried me alive. The silence stretched so long she thought he had hung up. But then, his voice came through, dark and furious. Where are they now? She hesitated. Banished. The village cast them out. Desmond let out a slow breath. Thank God you survived. Then, softer, I thought I lost you. Tears rolled down her cheeks. You almost did. Another pause. Then, firmly. You're coming to America. Her breath caught. What? I don't care what happened. I don't care how long it's been. You're coming. His voice was filled with determination. You've been through hell, Amarachi. But that life of suffering is over. I'm making the arrangements. I'm bringing you here. Her heart pounded. Desmond, after everything, you still want me. I never stopped wanting you. His voice softened. If anything, I want you even more. Amarachi covered her mouth, overwhelmed. After everything, there was still hope. Still a future. Still love. She whispered, okay. Desmond's voice was filled with relief. I'll take care of everything. Just get ready. As the call ended, Amarachi looked up at the sky. The past had tried to bury her. But the future was waiting. And this time, she wouldn't look back. The following weeks passed in a blur. Desmond worked tirelessly to speed up the visa process, and Amarachi prepared herself for a new life. But despite the excitement, a strange weight sat in her chest. The village had settled down, but whispers still followed her wherever she went. Some people treated her like a miracle, a living testimony of God's power. Others feared her, believing she had returned from the dead with something unnatural inside her. Even her own reflection in the mirror felt unfamiliar. The scars on her hands, the nightmares that woke her in the middle of the night, she was not the same Amarachi who had once dreamed of a future in America. She was something else now. On the night before her departure, Amarachi went to the place where it all had happened, the forest where she had been buried. The earth was disturbed, but the grave was still there, a shallow, open wound in the ground. She stood at the edge, staring down at the place where she had fought for her life. Her fists clenched. I survived, she whispered. You tried to take me, but I survived. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the leaves like distant whispers. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Then, just as she turned to leave, a shadow moved. Her breath caught in her throat. There, just beyond the trees, something, or someone, was watching her. She narrowed her eyes, her heart pounding. Who's there? No answer. But the air around her grew heavy, thick with something unseen. She took a slow step back. Then another. Suddenly, the whispering wind turned into a voice. Soft. Faint. Familiar. You should have stayed dead. Amarachi gasped and spun around, but there was no one there. The forest was empty. Her pulse raced. It had to be in her head. It had to be the trauma. But as she hurried back to the village, one thought refused to leave her mind. Not everything that was buried stays buried. And some things come back. The eerie feeling stayed with Amarachi all night. Even as she lay in bed, listening to the distant sounds of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog, she couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching her. Sleep refused to come, and when she finally drifted off, the nightmares came. She was back in the grave, the weight of the earth pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The voices of Chinello, Ifioma, and Ngozi whispered all around her. "You should have stayed dead." Amarachi gasped awake, her body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, but something felt off. She sat up, her breath uneven. Her mother slept soundly beside her, undisturbed. The night outside was still. Too still. Then, tap. 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 Her blood ran cold. It was coming from the window. Her fingers clutched the blanket as she turned her head slowly. A shadow moved just outside. Her breath caught. She wanted to scream, but Then, through the glass, she saw it. A face. Pale. Hollow. Eyes black as night. Amarachi's heart slammed against her ribs. It was Chinello. Or what used to be Chinello. The thing outside grinned, revealing teeth far too sharp. "You should have stayed dead," it whispered. Then, with unnatural speed, it disappeared into the night. Amarachi let out a strangled cry, stumbling out of bed. Her mother stirred, startled. "Amarachi. What is it?" She pointed at the window, her hands shaking. "Mama, someone was there." Her mother rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing. Just the empty night. She turned back to Amarachi, worry etched into her face. "You are just frightened, my child. Everything that happened, it is playing tricks on your mind." Amarachi wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. But deep down, she knew the truth. Chinello, Ifioma, and Ngozi had been banished. But something had followed her back from the grave. And it wasn't finished with her yet. The next morning, Amarachi was exhausted. She hadn't slept after what she had seen, or what she thought she had seen. The logical part of her mind told her it was just her trauma, her fears manifesting in the darkness. But her heart knew better. Something was wrong. She went about her day in a daze, packing up her belongings for her journey. By evening, she would be on a flight to America, leaving behind the village, the past, and the nightmares that haunted her. At least, that was what she hoped. As she folded the last of her clothes into a small suitcase, her mother walked in, carrying a bowl of food. "You need to eat," she said softly. "You barely touched your breakfast." Amarachi forced a smile. "I'm just nervous about the trip." Her mother sat beside her, rubbing her back gently. "Everything will be fine, my child. You are going to a new life, to a man who loves you." Amarachi nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She hadn't told her mother about what she had seen last night. If she did, she knew what would happen. Her mother would take her straight to Mama Adalai, the village elder, and they would perform prayers and rituals. She didn't have time for that. All she had to do was leave. Once she was far away, whatever haunted her would be left behind in the village. Wouldn't it? By afternoon, Amarachi was dressed and ready to go. Desmond had arranged a driver to take her to the city, where she would board her flight. Her mother hugged her tightly at the door, tears in her eyes. "Go and build a beautiful life, my daughter. But never forget where you come from." "I won't, Mama." Amarachi wiped her own tears. "I love you." Her mother held her face. "And I love you. Now go. Desmond is waiting." The car was already running, the driver waiting. Amarachi picked up her bag and stepped outside. But the moment she set foot on the dusty road, she felt it. The air around her thickened. The world seemed to slow. Somewhere in the distance, hidden among the trees, something was watching. A shiver ran down her spine. She quickened her pace, getting into the car and shutting the door. The driver gave her a polite nod before pulling onto the road. As they drove past the forest on the outskirts of the village, Amarachi forced herself not to look. She told herself it was over. She told herself she was safe. But just as they passed the burial site, the car engine sputtered. Then died. The vehicle rolled to a stop, right in front of the forest. Amarachi's stomach dropped. The driver frowned, turning the key. The engine coughed but didn't start. "Ah, what is this now?" he muttered, stepping out to check under the hood. Amarachi sat frozen, staring straight ahead. Then, tap, tap, tap. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned her head. A face stared at her through the window. Ngozi. Her skin was pale, her eyes black pits of emptiness. Her lips curled into a sickening grin. Amarachi's scream got caught in her throat. Ngozi's mouth moved, forming silent words. Then, suddenly, the whisper came. "You can't leave us, Amarachi." Amarachi gasped, scrambling to unlock the door on the other side. The driver's voice called from outside. "Madam, I think the car." The engine roared to life. Amarachi turned back to the window. Ngozi was gone. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the driver got back into the car, oblivious to what had just happened. "The car is fine now," he said, pulling back onto the road. "We will get to the city in no time." Amarachi didn't respond. She couldn't. Because as they drove away, she finally understood. She had escaped the grave. But they hadn't. And they weren't going to let her go so easily. The journey to the city felt like a nightmare. Amarachi sat stiffly in the back seat, her pulse racing, her hands trembling. She could still see Ngozi's face in her mind, those black, empty eyes, that twisted grin. "You can't leave us, Amarachi." Her stomach churned. She wanted to believe she was imagining things, that it was all just the trauma of her near-death experience. But deep down, she knew the truth. They were real. And they wanted her back. Hours later, the city lights came into view, glowing like distant fireflies in the night. The moment the car entered the bustling streets, Amarachi felt a weight lift from her chest. The village was far behind her now. She was safe. The driver pulled up to the airport, helping her unload her bags. "Safe journey, madam," he said with a polite nod. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching her suitcase tightly. Inside the airport, everything felt surreal. People bustled past, announcements echoed over the intercom, and the scent of coffee and airport food filled the air. She checked in her luggage, passed through security, and finally sat at her gate, staring out at the runway. Desmond had already sent a message. "Desmond, I can't wait to see you. I'll be at the airport when you land." A small smile touched her lips for the first time in weeks. It was almost over. The flight was smooth, and as the plane touched down in the United States, Amarachi felt a strange mixture of awe. When she stepped into the arrivals hall, she saw him. Desmond. Tall, handsome, eyes filled with emotion. The moment their eyes met, he rushed forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You're here," he whispered against her hair. "You're finally here." Tears slipped down Amarachi's cheeks. "Yes. I made it." He pulled back slightly, cupping her face. "You're safe now. No one can hurt you anymore." She nodded, though a tiny voice in the back of her mind whispered otherwise. But she pushed it down. She was in America now. A new beginning. A new life. The past was behind her. Or so she thought. That night, Desmond took her to his apartment, a cozy and warm place that already felt like home. He made her tea, wrapped her in a blanket, and held her close. For the first time in a long time, Amarachi felt peace. But at exactly midnight, that peace shattered. A noise echoed through the apartment. A soft, familiar sound. Tap. 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 Amarachi's blood turned to ice. Slowly, with shaking hands, she turned toward the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. Pale. Hollow. Dead. Chinello. Amarachi let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward. Chinello's lips moved, whispering the words Amarachi had feared all along. "You can't leave us." Desmond turned just in time to see Amarachi collapse to the floor, unconscious. And outside, in the shadows of the city, the ghosts of her past waited. But the dead had followed. And they would never let her go. We've gotten to the end of this story. If you made it to this part, I pray you receive an unexpected blessings this month. Share your opinion on what you think. Thank you.